The office tower trembled with the echo of alarms as glass screens lit up with breaking news banners that no one expected. Edward Kane said, "This is a lie, and they know it." His words cut through the chaos but failed to stop the collapse. Margaret Hayes leaned forward, her voice tight. "Edward, the board will see this as your failure." He turned, eyes sharp. "I built this empire, and no one will take it without a fight." The room filled with frantic typing, phones ringing, and whispers of betrayal weaving through the staff like poison. Thomas Reed pressed his hand against the glass window, whispering, "The market is bleeding already." Edward's jaw clenched as he scanned the scrolling headlines accusing him of fraud, power abuse, and reckless ambition. Margaret said, "We need containment, or this is over." He replied, "Containment is weakness. I'll crush whoever leaked this." Their shadows stretched under the harsh fluorescent lights, a battle already forming. In the distance, the city lights blinked like watchful eyes, waiting for him to fall. The air grew heavy as Edward paced the length of the boardroom, each step echoing like a countdown to disaster. Margaret said, "The shareholders will demand answers by morning." He snapped back, "Then they'll hear mine first." His voice carried venom and resolve. Thomas said, "But Edward, the markets move faster than words, and we're already bleeding." Edward turned sharply. "Markets bend to those who seize them, not those who beg." His words rattled Margaret, yet her gaze held firm. The staff whispered like shadows, their loyalty unraveling with each flicker of headlines. Edward stopped suddenly, hands gripping the table, as if anchoring himself against the storm outside. He said, "Whoever did this believes they can end me. They don't know what it means to fight me." Margaret leaned closer, her voice steady but sharp. "Edward, you can't treat this like war. The board doesn't fear you anymore." He snapped, "Fear is what keeps empires alive." Thomas said softly, "Or it destroys them." Edward's hand trembled as he adjusted his tie, eyes darting toward the storm outside. His reflection looked back like a stranger he no longer trusted. Margaret said, "We need strategy, not rage." Edward whispered, "Strategy is nothing without dominance." The sound of thunder cracked over the city, as if to punctuate his words. The phones kept ringing, unanswered, as the storm battered the city. Edward said, "Find out who leaked this, and I want their career ended before sunrise." Margaret frowned, and when the truth cuts deeper than lies, his eyes narrowed, then all cut deeper still. Thomas whispered, "This isn't leadership, Edward, it's desperation." The hum of machines and the pounding rain seemed to argue with every word spoken in the room. Edward gritted his teeth, the image of control slipping through his fingers like water. The night pressed closer, suffocating. Edward raised his voice, "This company is mine, and no one steals from me." Margaret said, "Empires fall when kings refuse to listen." He shot back, "And kings rise when they silence traitors." Thomas looked away, muttering, "Silence never built trust." The storm outside reached its peak, lightning tearing through the skyline like judgment itself. Edward's reflection in the window was fractured, each shard of glass a different version of his unraveling power. The storm outside had faded to a cold drizzle, but inside the tower, the tension only deepened. Edward Kane paced before the wall of screens, his eyes burning as new reports streamed in. Margaret Hayes said, "The press is circling like vultures, and silence won't hold them back." Edward snarled, "Then I'll give them a spectacle they'll never forget." Thomas Reed lowered his voice, "The board is already whispering. They'll want to vote." Edward turned, his expression sharp, "Votes are for the weak. Power doesn't wait for ballots." The room crackled with unease as staff exchanged nervous glances, the air thick with unspoken fear. Margaret said, "You can't choke the fire with more fire." Edward raised his hand, silencing her. "Every empire is built on smoke and steel. I will not bend." By morning, the crisis had spread beyond walls. In the marble lobby, journalists swarmed like hunters smelling blood. Edward Kane entered with sharp steps, voice like steel, "I will answer only to power, not to rumors." Margaret Hayes whispered at his side, "Every word you speak now will carve your fate." The cameras flashed like lightning, blinding, relentless. Edward raised his chin. "They want a villain. Then I'll give them a legend." Thomas Reed muttered, "Or you'll give them your crown." The crowd roared questions, each one louder, each one sharper. Edward's glare sliced through them as silence fell for a fleeting second. A king surrounded yet unbroken. The boardroom was filled with silent faces as the meeting began. Richard Doyle, the chairman, spoke coldly. "Confidence has been shaken, Edward." Edward Kane shot back, "Confidence is rebuilt by strength, not apologies." Margaret Hayes said, "Strength without trust is a house of glass." The board murmured, their expressions guarded. Edward leaned forward, his voice like a blade. "Do you think any rival could carry this empire without me?" Thomas Reed whispered, "Empires fall the moment leaders stop hearing the truth." Edward's eyes narrowed, scanning faces, searching for betrayal in the silence. Later that evening, Edward Kane retreated to his private office, its towering windows framing the storm-lit skyline. Margaret Hayes followed, saying, "If you don't soften, the board will cut you out." Edward growled, "They would cut off their own hands before severing me." Thomas Reed said quietly, "Your words sound more desperate with each hour." Edward turned on him. "Desperation is a tool, not a weakness." Margaret stepped closer, her tone steady, "Then wield it wisely before it devours you." Edward looked at the city below, its lights flickering like dying stars. The next day, whispers spread faster than news feeds. In the hushed corridor outside the board chambers, Margaret Hayes said, "They've called for an emergency vote." Edward Kane replied, voice low and venomous, "They will regret this rebellion." Thomas Reed shifted uneasily, muttering, "Rebellions are not always crushed. Sometimes they consume the throne." Edward's eyes glinted, "Then I will set fire to the throne before I surrender it." The sound of doors opening echoed down the hallway like a death knell. The war for control was no longer hidden, it had begun. The boardroom air grew heavier as whispers turned to knives. Edward Kane sat at the head of the table, his glare fixed on the silent faces. "Margaret Hayes," said Edward, "they're lining up against you." His voice cut sharply, "Let them. I will grind their plots to dust." Thomas Reed spoke carefully, "It isn't only the rivals, Edward. Someone inside feeds them." Edward leaned forward, knuckles white on the polished surface. "Then I'll drag the traitor into the light." Richard Doyle cleared his throat. "Trust once broken doesn't mend, Edward." Edward smirked bitterly. "Trust is the weakest currency in this empire." Silence followed, yet unease lingered like smoke. Later in the dim corridor, Margaret Hayes confronted Edward Kane, her tone low. "You're blind if you can see the dagger behind your back." Edward answered, "And whose hand holds it, Margaret?" "Perhaps yours." She stiffened. "I stayed when others left. If betrayal was my aim, you'd already be on the floor." Thomas Reed stepped in quietly. "Pointing fingers only sharpens the blade." Edward's gaze swept across them, fire in his eyes. "If one of you is the snake, I'll cut the head myself." Margaret's silence burned like an accusation left unsaid. The next morning, Edward Kane stormed into his office to find documents spread across his desk. Margaret Hayes said, "These were leaked confidential acquisitions, your signature." Edward slammed the papers down. "Forgery or treachery, I don't care. Someone pays for this." Thomas Reed said softly, "The leak is too precise, Edward. Only someone trusted had access." Edward's eyes narrowed, voice like a blade. "Then betrayal wears a familiar face." The room quivered with the hum of storm winds outside, as if the city itself recoiled. Margaret whispered, "Be careful, or you'll destroy the last of your allies." In a secluded restaurant booth that evening, Edward Kane met with Daniel Cross, a rival executive. Daniel said, "Your walls are crumbling, Edward. Perhaps it's time to step aside." Edward smirked. "You mistake smoke for fire, Daniel. This empire still breathes." Daniel leaned closer, his voice like poison. "But whose breath sustains it when your own allies bleed you dry?" Edward clenched his jaw. "Anyone who tries to poison me will choke first." Daniel chuckled darkly. We'll see who drowns when the tide rises. Their glasses clinked, but the sound was more like a warning bell than a toast. Back at the tower, Edward Kane stood alone at the window, storm still raging. Thomas Reed entered quietly, saying, "Daniel is playing you. He wants you isolated." Edward didn't turn, his reflection fractured in the glass. "Isolation sharpens resolve," he muttered. Thomas said, "or it cracks the mind." Edward finally faced him, eyes bloodshot. "Loyalty is the rarest gift, Thomas. Do not waste it." The hum of thunder rolled across the skyline as Edward whispered, "If the traitor walks among us, then tomorrow the knife will meet its target." The storm broke into a heavy rain as Edward Kane walked into the grand board chamber, his shoulders squared like a general ready for war. Margaret Hayes whispered, "Daniel Cross is pulling the board apart piece by piece." Edward's eyes darkened, "Then I'll scatter him before he binds them." Richard Doyle cleared his throat. "Daniel has influence, Edward. His voice echoes through shareholders' ears, louder than yours now." Edward leaned across the table, his voice thunder. "Power doesn't echo. It strikes." Thomas Reed muttered, "Strikes draw blood, and you're already bleeding." Silence wrapped the chamber as screens lit with Daniel's proposal for a hostile takeover. Edward's jaw tightened. If he wants a war, he'll have one. Later that evening, Edward Kane faced Daniel Cross in a private suite, overlooking the city skyline. Daniel smirked. "The empire you cling to is rotting. I'll carve it from your hands." Edward's voice was low, dangerous. "Empires, and carved. Daniel. They're stolen in the dark." Daniel raised his glass. "And I already hold the blade." Margaret Hayes, standing in the corner, said firmly, "This fight will destroy both of you." Daniel replied, "Then ashes will choose their master." Edward's glare could cut steel as lightning cracked the horizon, his silence more lethal than words. The following morning, the press swarmed outside the tower as news of Daniel Cross's bid leaked. Cameras flashed as Edward Kane emerged, his face carved with fury. Reporters shouted questions about fraud and collapse. Edward raised his hand, voice cutting through chaos. "This empire does not bend. It does not break." Margaret Hayes whispered near him, "Every word feeds the fire." Edward answered, "Then let it burn hotter than they can survive." Thomas Reed stood behind, whispering, "Your fire may scorch us all." The storm winds howled against glass doors as if echoing the rising war. Inside a dimly lit strategy room, Edward Kane gathered allies around a glowing digital map of the company. Margaret Hayes said, "Half the board is already leaning toward Daniel Cross." Edward's glare burned, then leaned them back with fear. Thomas Reed said carefully, "Fear fractures faster than loyalty." Edward slammed his hand on the table, "Then let fracture be my weapon." Margaret frowned. "Weapons cut both ways." Edward's voice turned low and venomous. "Better to bleed them all than to bow." The hum of machines filled the silence, like a drumbeat for war. By midnight, Edward Kane stood on the balcony of his office, storm raging harder than ever. Margaret Hayes approached. "Daniel Cross has more allies than you think. This war may not be winnable." Edward's eyes narrowed. "Wars aren't won by numbers. They're won by resolve." Thomas Reed stepped forward quietly. "Resolve can't shield us when knives are already at our backs." Edward turned, voice like thunder, "Then I'll take the knives and use them." Lightning split the sky as Edward whispered, "This empire won't be taken, not while I breathe." The tower's lowest floor hummed with secrecy as Edward Kane descended into the restricted archives, his footsteps echoing like judgment. Margaret Hayes followed close, whispering, "If the leak came from inside, it begins here." Edward's eyes scanned glowing files, his voice harsh, "Secrets don't rot alone, they are carried." Thomas Reed arrived with unease etched into his face. "These records were copied days ago. Whoever did it walked through our doors unnoticed." Edward slammed the drawer shut, sparks of fury in his eyes. "Then we are not fighting rivals. We are fighting ghosts in our own walls." The shadows of the room stretched long, the silence filled with suspicion that bled into every breath. That night, Edward Kane met Richard Doyle in the quiet corners of a private library. Richard Doyle's voice carried weight. Ambition is fire, Edward. But fire consumes its owner when left unchecked. Edward's jaw tightened. And yet without fire, nothing is forged. Richard looked into the flames of the hearth. I lost everything when I believed I was untouchable. Don't follow me into that ruin. Edward leaned closer, his voice sharp. I don't follow paths of ruin. I build new ones. Richard's sigh was heavy with regret, the room drowning in the ghost of old wars. In a darkened garage beneath the tower, Margaret Hayes found discarded security footage drives. She said, someone tried to erase this, but not well enough. Edward Kane stepped into the shadows, his voice cutting. Show me. Thomas Reed inserted the drive. The screen flickered, revealing a hooded figure moving through restricted areas. Margaret whispered, a spy within our walls. Edward clenched his fists. No enemy outside can match betrayal from within. Thomas muttered, the noose tightens, Edward, and the rope is ours. Edward's glare pierced the screen, the faceless saboteur now a phantom enemy. Hours later, in his office, Edward Kane stared at a financial report left anonymously on his desk. Margaret Hayes read aloud, a shadow investor holds more shares than disclosed. Ah, Edward muttered, a phantom hand moving pieces in silence. Thomas Reed's voice trembled, whoever they are. They've been here longer than we realized. Edward turned toward the storm outside, his reflection fractured. Every empire falls when unseen hands tighten chains. But I will snap those chains. Margaret said firmly, if you don't see who holds the chain, it may already be too late. The silence was heavier than thunder. Close to dawn, Edward Kane walked through the empty tower halls, his footsteps echoing like a funeral march. Margaret Hayes joined him, saying softly, you look into shadows so deeply, they may swallow you. Edward's eyes burned, better swallowed than blind. Thomas Reed appeared from the corner, whispering, the walls bleed secrets, Edward, and secrets don't stop until someone does. Edward stopped beneath the crest of his empire, whispering like a vow. Then tomorrow the shadows will learn that I fight in darkness better than they do. His words echoed against marble, as if even the building doubted him. The storm inside the tower grew darker than the one outside as Edward Kane summoned his closest allies. Margaret Hayes, said Daniel Cross, has won over half the board. If they vote tonight, he takes everything. Edward's voice thundered, not while I live. Thomas Reed shifted uneasily, whispering, it may not be Daniel you should fear. Edward's eyes narrowed, speak plainly. Thomas shook his head, the knife will not come from your enemy. It will come from your table. Edward scanned their faces, suspicion coiling around him like smoke. Margaret said firmly, then trust no one, Edward, not even me. Edward muttered, trust is already a corpse. The silence cracked as betrayal's shadow thickened around them. That evening, Edward Kane returned to his private office to find confidential files scattered across his desk. Margaret Hayes followed, whispering, someone wanted you to see this. Edward scanned the papers, his face twisting with fury. These are my private directives, shared outside these walls. Thomas Reed said carefully, the betrayer is not hiding anymore. They want you paranoid. Edward slammed his fist on the desk, then let them see what paranoia looks like. Margaret frowned. Or perhaps they want you broken, Edward. His reflection fractured in the glass, each shard showing a different enemy. Later that night in a secluded parking garage, Edward Kane confronted Margaret Hayes and Thomas Reed. Edward's voice was sharp. One of you feeds Daniel Cross my blood. Margaret shot back, if I betrayed you, Edward, you would already be ashes. Thomas said quickly, blame me, if it saves your empire, but no, it won't change your fate. Edward's fists shook, his eyes blazing. I will burn the traitor with my own hands. Margaret stepped closer, her voice like steel. Then you better be certain who you strike, because one mistake will finish you. The air was thick with suspicion, betrayal hiding in the silence. At dawn, the board convened in secrecy. Richard Doyle cleared his throat. Daniel Cross has the numbers. Edward Kane stormed into the chamber, his voice like thunder. Numbers crumble before power. Daniel Cross smirked across the table. Power without trust is a corpse walking. Edward's glare cut through him. Trust is for children. Empires are ruled by fear. Margaret Hayes said coldly. And yet fear makes even the strongest king stumble. Edward looked at her, suspicion deepening as silence swallowed the room. Thomas Reed whispered, "The dagger is already raised." Edward muttered, "Then let it fall on me and see if I break." When the vote was called, Edward Kane raised his hand to speak, but Margaret Hayes stood first. Her voice was sharp. "This empire cannot survive under a tyrant. My vote is against Edward Kane." Gasps tore through the room. Edward's face froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You," he whispered, "you were the knife." Margaret's expression did not falter. "I was always the knife. You were too blind to see it." Daniel Cross' smirk widened as the board erupted. Thomas Reed muttered, "The end was never outside, Edward. It was always within." Lightning cracked across the skyline, sealing the betrayal in fire and shadow. The board chamber was drowned in stormlight as Edward Kane rose, his voice trembling but unbroken. "You betray me in front of vultures, Margaret Hayes. Yet the ashes will remember my name." Margaret Hayes said, "The empire deserves survival, not your madness." Daniel Cross leaned back smugly. "Your reign ends tonight, Edward. The board has chosen." Richard Doyle spoke with gravity. "The vote stands unless Edward concedes." Edward's fists clenched, his glare piercing. "I concede nothing. I am not finished." Thomas Reed whispered, "You're finished the moment you refuse to see truth." The storm outside thundered like a gavel striking final judgment. Edward Kane stormed from the chamber into the corridor, his reflection fractured on the marble walls. Margaret Hayes followed, her voice sharp. "You turned trust into ruin, Edward." Edward spat back, "And you turned loyalty into poison." Thomas Reed stepped cautiously between them. "The knives are drawn, and there's no walking back." Margaret Hayes narrowed her eyes. "You built this empire on fear, and fear has come for you." Edward leaned in, his whisper venom. "Fear obeys me, it never owns me." The silence rang louder than the thunder outside. At midnight, Edward Kane entered his private office for what felt like the last time. Rain streaked the glass behind him as Daniel Cross stood waiting, smirk unshaken. "This is where kings fall," Daniel said calmly. Edward's glare burned. "This is where thieves choke." Margaret Hayes appeared at the doorway, her voice cutting. "You were never a king, Edward, only a tyrant." Thomas Reed lingered in the corner, whispering, "And tyrants always face their reckoning." Edward's chest heaved as lightning lit the skyline, each flash a reminder of everything he built now slipping into fire. The boardroom reconvened for the final confrontation. "Well," Edward Kane spoke with a raw voice, "take everything, but remember, I built this empire from blood." Margaret Hayes said, "You built it on the bones of those you crushed." Daniel Cross declared, "This empire rises under my hand now." Richard Doyle's voice was solemn. "The vote is sealed. Edward Kane is stripped of power." Edward staggered as if struck, his breath sharp. "You may strip my throne, but not my name." Thomas Reed muttered, "Names fade faster than thrones." The board sat in silence as lightning cracked like applause. When silence fell, Edward Kane walked slowly to the window, staring at the storm breaking over the city. Margaret Hayes turned away, her face stone. Daniel Cross whispered, "The empire breathes under my rule now." Thomas Reed said softly, "What remains of you, Edward?" Edward's voice was hollow but unyielding. "Empires die, but shadows remain, and I will be the shadow haunting you all." Lightning blazed one last time as Edward's silhouette stood against the glass, fractured, powerful, and ruined all at once. The room froze in silence, the storm carrying his vow into the night.